Hello everyone and welcome to Matukate. And today with me I have Tirumala Venkata Devaraya, who is 20th direct line descendant of the great South Indian King Shri Krishna Devaraya. And in this episode we talk about the deplorable condition that Hampi is in right now and why that is and what you and I can do. We also talk about the significance of Vijayanagara Empire in the history of our country and favorite spot of his and much more. The audio version of this podcast is available on Spotify and Google Podcast, links to which is in the description. And if you're already listening to me on Spotify, then good for you. And I hope you enjoy this episode. So hi Tirumala, welcome to the podcast Matukate, and it is a pleasure to have you on our podcast. And how are you doing?
I'm good, Manish. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. In fact, thank you for having me.
The reason we are doing this podcast, as discussed, was to bring awareness about the deplorable situation in Hampi right now. So I want to start by asking you to elaborate on the situation that we are having right now.
Well, there are many aspects to the current horrible situation that Hampi is facing. First off, I think there hasn't been a proper maintenance or conservation, in fact, of the monuments and the area itself. Because one thing that I hear a lot from a lot of people is that Hampi is the pride of our nation. And it saddens me because if this is how the pride of our nation is being treated, like it's in a horrible condition. There's trash littered everywhere. You've got the monuments being vandalized. The security guards aren't present at most monuments, in fact. And just recently, I'd been to the Achutraya temple, which is in fact the second largest temple in Hampi, believe it or not. And this temple had no guards. The gate was broken. There were fireworks being lit by some kids inside who were also playing football. So, this is the state that such great monuments and like this is the heritage of our nation that we should be conserving. If we feel such apathy towards our own heritage, then why would anyone else care about it?
Do you think the conservation is not happening in the right way because of the approach taken by the concerned authorities? Is that what you feel?
To be completely honest, Manish, I don't think there is a lot of conservation happening at all. That's the truth of the issue. I'm not saying that the ASI hasn't done any work when it comes to Hampi. Before, they've done marvelous work, in fact, as most of the ruins and all of this stuff was unearthed by the ASI a few decades ago. But in the present day, when it comes to taking care of these monuments and the old heritage sites, almost minimal effort is done on their part. I feel they've relegated the status of even the Virupaksha temple. Like recently, the locals who used to sell like bananas and fruits, basically, since it's a temple, when people do in
Yes.
front of temples, they were asked to leave because it's a tourism spot and they needed to conserve it. And I think this is wrong as well because in the end, it is a temple, and what are temples for? For pujas to give out to get blessings from God, etc. And the part which astounds me is that even after like relegating most of the other temples to just monuments for the sake of conservation, they haven't done so. And another thing I would say is they're more focused on creating tourism for the place without actually conserving it again. Like uh, just 2 days ago, the palace wall of Aliya Ramaraya's palace collapsed due to a bore well being drilled not even 50 meters away from it. And they were building new buildings like 15, 20 meters away from the old monuments. So, as I said, I think they're more focused on accommodating tourists, etc., instead of actually caring about the monuments, which again, I think is the wrong way to approach the issue.
Yeah, and there are a lot of organizations working in Hampi because it's a World Heritage Site, and even there are NGOs in the place, right? So, what do you think is the administrative hurdle that is happening because due to which these kind of situations are happening?
I think the administrative hurdle would be that there are too many organizations in Hampi at the moment, and each one seems to be blaming the other when it comes to the conservation of these monuments. I mean, lack of conservation, more like. And anytime something happens, like a wall falls down or there's vandalism, the each of the organizations just enter into a blame game where they blame the others for their lack of care towards the monuments. So I think this is in fact harming the place more than it is helping because of all these organizations. No one is willing to take any responsibility for the monuments.
And do you think this is also a result of not having enough funds to conserve the place?
From what I've heard, Hampi gets a lot of funding. From what I know, I'm not 100% sure of this, so you don't take my word on it. But as far as I know, Hampi gets crores of money every year for funding, and again, there were places which I visited where it's shown that this took 10 crores, and all that's done is they've built a wall. I'm like, that clearly does not take that much money. So somewhere down the line, I don't think the funds are being utilized for what they're supposed to be.
And even about conserving it, do you think ASI or any concerned authority for that matter is using up to date methods to conserve the monuments?
Another thing which I would like to share about this is really funny is the stuff which I've seen in Hampi, which was built 500-600 years ago, is better than the ones that they're building these days. It looks better. That's the worst part. Like with everything we have these days, it should be marvelous. We shouldn't have to
Yes.
compare to what they were building 500-600 years ago. But their construction work and their architecture and the way they have built things is just at least 10 to 20 times better than what they're doing right now. Uh, I can send you some pictures later as well.
Yes.
It's horrible.
And do you think uh, the conservation is not happening in the right way because they think about it as ruin or dead culture? Like your father said in one of his interviews, right? The approach is wrong because they are treating it as ruin and dead culture, whereas the soul of Hampi is still alive. What do you have to say about that?
I very much agree with that statement. And I think that for Hampi to regain its former glory, or not former glory, I think that would be a bit far fetched because in its heyday, it was the largest city in the world, actually. So, but to regain some of that former glory, I think what we need to do is, again, not treat it as just a dead city and just ruins to look at, but rather I wouldn't say rebuild everything because that would again not be feasible. But there are a lot of temples which are still in a condition which can be restored. Like these temples can be restored easily if the government, ASI, etc., took the initiative, I think. And as my father said, he wants to see these temples restored and like puja started again in these temples. Like some, such as the Hazar Rama temple, they're in quite good condition. Like the only thing missing perhaps is a murti of the Lord inside. And I think again, yes, the approach that these organizations are taking towards Hampi is just completely wrong. And we should see it as a living, breathing city. And Again, as I said, the ASI, and it was the ASI, I think, who asked some of the locals to leave. It's like you can't ask people, like they've been there for so many years, and you can't just ask them to leave. Like they're treating it as just monuments and not as temples.
So yeah, I do agree with that. And we are conducting drives about, you, I think it was last week when you did a cleanliness drive near Virupaksha temple, I think.
Yeah, I did one today as well at Anjani Parvat,
Okay.
birthplace of Lord Hanuman.
Yeah. And apart from this, you're also, I've, since I've been following you, I've seen that you believe that a lot of us don't know the impact of Vijayanagara Empire in the history of our great country, right? So can you just educate us on the significance of Vijayanagara Empire and its glory days?
So I believe that the Vijayanagara Empire at its zenith. Actually, let's talk about the foundation of the Vijayanagara Empire first. The basic principle for the foundation of the empire itself was the protection of the Sanatana Dharma, actually. As the Delhi Sultanate at this time had overrun much of the country, and they were making incursions into South India. And there was a small kingdom, in fact, which is not far from Hampi. It was called the Kingdom of Kampli. And the king there, it was in his court that Haryana, it is reputed that Haryana and Bukka were part of before they became the first emperors. So his kingdom was overrun by the Deccan Sultanates. And again, I don't think many people know this, but there's actually a Johar committed there by the women and to save themselves from the incoming onslaught of the armies of the north. So the main philosophy or the founding principle behind the empire was the protection of this southern Sanatan Dharma, the southern Hindu culture. It was relatively a loose collection of all the various kingdoms because when it initially started, they weren't unified as such. But then over the years, the unifying principle again was the protection of our culture, of our identity, I suppose. And as the Vijayanagara Empire progressed, you see more and more of this. But at the same time, the Vijayanagara Empire wasn't just like a Hindu empire. It wasn't that. Because if you see the court of the great kings such as Prauda Devaraya or Krishna Devaraya or Ali Ramaraya, he wasn't actually king, but he was the de facto ruler of the empire. They all had prominent uh, generals, statesmen from other cultures and other religions as well. So the unifying principle being Hinduism did not, I could say, did not uh, alter the fact that it was a secular empire in its sense, because the emperors promoted other religions as well. Even if you visit Hampi these days, there are quarters for other religions like the Muslim quarters, the Jewish quarters, etc. So I think the main focus of the Vijayanagara Empire was a peaceful kingdom for all, but at the same time protecting our religion because it was under threat at that time. As I said, most of North India was already overrun. And the Vijayanagara, another thing which most people don't know about the Vijayanagara Empire was that it didn't just fall apart after the Battle of Talikota. And the Battle of Talikota happened in 1565. And about 20 years after that, there was a revival of the empire, even under Venkatapati Raya, who managed to restore most of the empire, not almost most of the empire actually. And this is a fact which I think most people don't know about at all, because from what I hear from a lot of people is that after the Battle of Talikota, the empire just collapsed. And even if you read on, I mean, Wikipedia isn't the most reliable of sources, but even on Wikipedia, it's just stated that after the Battle of Talikota, the empire disbanded. decline and the emperor was no longer in power, which again isn't true. For, for Venkata Devaraya during his entire rule managed to keep a good hold of the empire. And after his death, it faded. The emperor's power faded due to internal struggles and I suppose the rise of other kingdoms within the empire who wanted to assert their own independence. So, yes, the Vijayanagara Empire, in its essence, was a kingdom which focused on the protection of our culture. And it's, yeah, I think that's about it. Actually.
Yeah. And what do you feel like? What's your next step to kind of go on and battle this administrative, what do you call it, administrative deficiency? So what are your future plans to raise awareness and restore the uh, monuments and such, and what can I or the general public do about it?
Okay, so I suppose, like, at the moment, I myself personally am not battling against the authorities to say. And I think at this stage, what as I'm still a university student, I'm still studying, etc. So I think what I'm just trying to do is create awareness on the issue primarily, and at the same time, as you said earlier, the cleaning drives and etc. Like my little bit, what I can do, and just help preserve the culture and the heritage from my side, basically, the little bits and pieces that I can do. And for the future, I plan to keep continue, like just continue with the cleaning drives, etc., that I'm doing right now. And it's just not the monuments themselves. I'm actually also hoping to focus on the local people as well, because in the as I said, the government in treating Hampi as a dead city have forgotten about the actual people who live here, that there are actual people who still reside in this area. So I'm planning on taking some initiatives to help them as well, so that they don't suffer from the lack of apathy from the other people. Uh, and for the general public, I suppose creating awareness and pressing the issue in your own way, I suppose, because if everyone starts to have a problem with how Hampi is being treated, I suppose the government should do something.
Yes, and what do you want to tell to the tourists that come to Hampi?
Yes, I guess all the tourists who come to Hampi, is my humble request, please don't vandalize the monuments. I shouldn't be saying this. This is common sense. Don't vandalize the monuments. Don't litter. Like, this is an area which should be treated with the utmost respect. And I've seen, like, in the UK or the US, they treat their monuments and heritage sites with such reverence, which I fail to see in this country. Like, it's sad that people just come, they take photos, and again, they're just throwing things everywhere, vandalizing. Like, that's not how you treat these places. It's apathy from the general public as well, in a sense, because they only think of it as a day's like a day's picnic. Like, I've gone to Hampi, I'm going to take a few pictures, and I don't care what I'm actually doing there when it comes to littering or vandalizing. Like, before, I used to see pictures with some vandals used to take pictures with their own handiwork on the monuments. It's just like blatant disregard for our culture and our heritage. And again, another thing that one step I have to like laud the government for doing, like laud the government. Wait, I'll do that bit again. Sorry. One step that I have to applaud the government for taking is that they got rid of the area known as Virupapurukata. They got rid of a lot of illegal establishments in that area because there were a lot of places there which, again, were engaged in activities which shouldn't be conducted in an area such as Hampi. I mean, you can go do these things elsewhere. I mean, I'm not going to judge.
Yes.
I don't have a problem, but go ahead. But in that particular place, I do have a problem because that's like going to, again, like this is a temple. This area is literally a temple, an area of temples, etc. And I have a problem with activities like nefarious activities such as those being conducted in this area because again that's a total disregard for our own heritage and culture.
And and I want to ask you this, like, what is your favorite spot in Hampi? Like every one of us has one favorite spot if you're living in and around Hampi. What is yours?
My favorite spots would be probably the Virupaksha temple one because it's still the only living, breathing temple within Hampi. And I love going there, feeding the monkeys, the elephant there, who I've interacted with since I was 6 or 7 years old. And another one would be the Hazara Rama temple, which has very, which whose the Hazara Rama temple, which has a very intricate style of carving and architecture to it. And it's also another one of the temples which is in relatively good condition compared to the rest of them, which were destroyed during the invasion of the city, I suppose.
Yeah. And on that note, I want to end this podcast. And it's been lovely having you on the podcast. And thank you for doing this with me.
Thank you for having me.